Hello, eighth graders, and welcome to Friday's edition of The Book Thief. We are in part two, and we are on 100% pure German sweat. People lined the streets as the youth of Germany marched toward the town hall in the square. On quite a few occasions, Liesel forgot about her mother and any other problem of which she currently held ownership. There was a swell in her chest as the people clapped them on. Some kids waved to their parents, but only briefly. There was an explicit instruction that they march straight and don't look or wave to the crowd. When Rudy's group came into the square and was instructed to halt, there was a discrepancy. Tommy Mueller, the rest of the regiment stopped marching, and Tommy plowed directly into the boy in front of him. Dummkopf, the boy spat before turning around. I'm sorry, said Tommy, arms held apologetically out. His face tripped over itself. Couldn't hear. It was only a small moment, but it was also a preview of troubles to come for Tommy, for Rudy. At the end of the marching, the Hitler Youth divisions were allowed to disperse. It would have been near impossible to keep them all together, as the bonfire burned in their eyes and excited them. Together they cried one united Heil Hitler, and were free to wander. Liesel looked for Rudy, but once the crowd of children scattered, she was caught inside a mess of uniforms and high-pitched words, kids calling out to other kids. By 4:30, the air had cooled considerably. People joked that they needed warming up. That's all this trash is good for anyway. Carts were used to wheel it all in. It was dumped in the middle of the town square and doused with something sweet. Books and paper and other material would slide or tumble down, only to be thrown back onto the pile. From further away, it looked like something volcanic, or something grotesque, and alien, that had somehow landed miraculously in the middle of town and needed to be snuffed out, and fast. The applied smell leaned toward the crowd, who were kept at a good distance. There were well in excess of 1,000 people on the ground, on the town hall steps, on the rooftops that surrounded the square. When Liesel tried to make her way through, a crackling sound prompted her to think that the fire had already begun. It hadn't. The sound was kinetic humans, flowing, charging up. They started without me. Although something inside told her that this was a crime. After all, her three books were the most precious items she owned. She was compelled to see the thing lit. She couldn't help it. I guess humans like to watch a little destruction. Sand castles, houses of cards. That's where they began. Their great skill is their capacity to escalate. The thought of missing it was erased when she found a gap in the bodies and was able to see the mound of guilt still intact. It was prodded and splashed, even spat on. It reminded her of an unpopular child, forlorn and bewildered, powerless to alter its fate. No one liked it. Head down, hands in pockets, forever. Amen. Bits and pieces continued falling to its sides as Liesel hunted for Rudy. Where is that sockle? When she looked up, the sky was crouching. A horizon of Nazi flags and uniforms rose upward, crippling her view every time she attempted to see over a smaller child's head. It was pointless. The crowd itself, there was no swaying it, squeezing through, or reasoning with it. You breathed with it, and you sang its songs. You waited for its fire. Silence was requested by a man on a podium. His uniform was shiny brown. The iron was practically still on it. The silence began. His first words, Heil Hitler. His first action, the salute to the Fuhrer. Today is a beautiful day, he continued. Not only is it our great leader's birthday, but we also stop our enemies once again. We stop them reaching into our minds. Liesel still attempted to fight her way through. We put an end to the disease that has been spread through Germany for the last 20 years, if not more. He was performing now what is called a Cherie, a consummate exhibition of passionate shouting, warning the crowd to be watchful, to be vigilant, to seek out and destroy the evil machinations plotting to infect the motherland with its deplorable ways. The immoral, the communism. The, co- the Kommunenstein, that word again, that old word, dark rooms, suit wearing men, Die Juden, the Jews. Halfway through the speech, Liesel surrendered. As the word communist seized her, the remainder of the Nazi recital swept by either side, lost somewhere the German feet around her. Waterfalls of words, a girl treading water. She thought it again. Kommunisten. Up until now, at the PDM, they had been told that Germany was the superior race, but no one else in particular had been mentioned. Of course, everyone knew about the Jews, as they were the main offender in regard to violating the German ideal. Not once, however, had the communists been mentioned until today, regardless of the fact that people of such political creed were also to be punished. She had to get out. In front of her, head with parted blonde hair and pigtails sat absolutely still, excuse me, on its shoulders. Staring into it, Liesel revisited those dark rooms of her past, and her mother answering questions made up of one word. She saw it all too clearly. Her starving mother, her missing father, communist end, her dead brother. And now we say goodbye to this trash, this poison. Just before Liesel Meminger pivoted with nausea to exit the crowd, the shiny, brown shirted creature walked from the podium. He received a torch from an accomplice and lit the mound, which dwarfed him in all its culpability. Heil Hitler! The audience. Heil Hitler! A collection of men walked from a platform and surrounded the heap, igniting it, much to the approval of everyone. Voices climbed over shoulders, and the smell of pure German sweat struggled at first, then poured out. It rounded corner after corner till they were all swimming in it. The words, the sweat, and smiling. Let's not forget the smiling. Many jocular comments followed, as did another onslaught of Heil Hitlering. It actually makes me wonder if anyone ever lost an eye or injured a hand or wrist with all that. You'd only need to be facing the wrong way at the wrong time or stand marginally too close to another person. Perhaps people did get injured. Personally, I can only tell you that no one died from it, or at least not physically. There were, of course, the matter of 40 million people I picked up by the time the whole thing was finished. But that's getting all metaphoric. Allow me to return us to the fire. The orange flames waved at the crowd as paper and print dissolved inside them. Burning words were torn from the sentences. On the other side, beyond the blurry heat, it was possible to see the brown shirts and swastikas joining hands. You didn't see people, only uniforms and signs. Birds above did laps. They circled, somehow attracted to the glow, until they came too close to the heat. Or was it the humans? Certainly the heat was nothing. In her attempt to escape, a voice found her. Liesel. It made its way through, and she recognized it. It was not Rudy, but she knew the voice. She twisted free and found the face attached to it. Oh no, Ludwig Schmeichel. He did not, as she expected, sneer or joke or make any conversation at all. All he was able to do was pull her toward him and motion to his ankle. It had been crushed among the incitement and was bleeding dark and ominous through his sock. His face wore a helpless expression beneath his tangled blonde hair. An animal? Not a deer in lights, nothing so typical or specific. He was just an animal, hurt among the melee of its own kind, soon to be trampled by it. Somehow she helped him up and dragged him toward the back. Fresh air. They staggered to the steps at the side of the church. There was some room there, and they rested, both relieved. Breath collapsed from Schmeichel's mouth. It slipped down over his throat. He managed to speak. Sitting down, he held his ankle and found Liesel Meminger's face. Thanks, he said to her, mouth rather than her eyes. More slabs of breath, and they both watched images of schoolyard antics, followed by a schoolyard beating. I'm sorry for, you know, Liesel heard it again. Communist end. She chose, however, to focus on Ludwig Schmeichel. Me too. They both concentrated on breathing in, for there was nothing more to do or say. Their business had come to an end. The blood enlarged on Ludwig Schmeichel's ankle. A single word leaned against the girl. To their left, flames and burning books were cheered like heroes. The gates of thievery. She remained on the steps, waiting for Papa, watching the stray ash and the corpse of collected books. Everything was sad. Orange and red embers looked like rejected candy, and most of the crowd had vanished. She'd seen Frau Driller, very satisfied, and Fifkus, white hair, a Nazi uniform, the same dilapidated shoes, and a triumphant whistle. Now there was nothing but cleaning up, and soon no one would even imagine it had happened. But you could smell it. What are you doing? Hans Huberman arrived at the church steps. Hi, Papa. He was supposed to be in front of town hall. Sorry, Papa. He sat down next to her, having his tallness on the concrete and taking a piece of Liesel's hair. His fingers adjusted it gently behind her ear. Liesel, what's wrong? For a while, she said nothing. She was making calculations, despite already knowing. An 11-year-old girl is many things, but she is not stupid. Small addition. The word communist, plus a large bonfire, plus a collection of dead letters, plus the suffering of her mother, plus the death of her brother equals the Fuhrer. The Fuhrer. He was the they that Hans and Rosa Huberman were talking about that evening when she first wrote to her mother. She knew it, but she had to ask. Is my mother a communist? Staring straight ahead, they were always asking her things before I came here. Hans edged forward a little, forming the beginnings of a lie. I have no idea. I never met her. Did the Fuhrer take her away? The question surprised them both, and it forced Papa to stand up. He looked at the brown shirted men, taking the pile of ash with shovels. He could hear them hacking into it. Another lie was growing in his mouth, but he found it impossible to let it out. He said, I think he might have, yes. I knew it. The words were thrown at the steps, and Liesel could feel the slush of anger stirring hotly in her stomach. I hate the Fuhrer, she said. I hate him. And Hans Huberman, what did he do? What did he say? Did he bend down and embrace his foster daughter as he wanted to? Did he tell her that he was sorry for what was happening to her mother, and for what had happened to her brother? Not exactly. He clenched his eyes, then opened them. He slapped Liesel Meminger squarely in the face. Don't ever say that. His voice was quiet but sharp. As the girl shook and sagged into the steps, he sat next to her and held his face in his hands. It would be easy to say that he was just a tall man sitting poor postured and shattered on some church steps, but he wasn't. At the time, Lisa had no idea that her foster father, Hans Huberman, was contemplating one of the most dangerous dilemmas a German citizen could face. Not only that, he'd been facing it for close to a year. Papa, surprise in her voice, rushed her, but it also rendered her useless. She wanted to run, but she couldn't. She could take a Varchin from nuns and Rosas, but it hurt so much more from Papa. The hands were gone from Papa's face now, and he found the resolve to speak again. You can say that in our house, he said, looking gravely at Liesel's cheek, but you never say it on the street, at school, at the BDM, never. He stood in front of her and lifted her by the triceps. He shook her. Do you hear me? With her eyes trapped wide open, Liesel nodded her compliance. It was, in fact, a rehearsal for a future lecture. When all of Hans Huberman's worst fears arrived on Himmel Street later that year, in the early hours of a November morning. Good. You placed her back down. Good. He placed her back down. Now let us try. At the bottom of the steps, Papa stood erect and cocked his arm. 45 degrees. Heil Hitler. Liesel stood up and also raised her arm. With absolute misery, she repeated it. Heil Hitler. It was quite a sight, an 11-year-old girl trying not to cry on the church steps, saluting the Fuhrer as the voices over Papa's shoulder chopped and beat the dark shape in the background. Are we still friends? Perhaps a quarter of an hour later, Papa held a cigarette olive branch in his palm, the paper and tobacco he'd just received. Without a word, Liesel reached gloomily across and proceeded to roll it. For quite a while they sat together. Smoke climbed over Papa's shoulder. After another 10 minutes, the gates of thievery would open just a crack, and Liesel Meminger would widen them a little further and squeeze through. Two questions. Would the gates shut behind her? Or would they have the goodwill to let her back out? As Liesel would discover, a good thief requires many things: stealth, nerve, speed. More important than any of those things, however, was one final requirement: luck. Actually, forget the 10 minutes. The gate's open now. Book of Fire. The dark came in pieces, and with a cigarette brought to an end, Liesel and Hans Huber began to walk home. To get out of the square, they would walk past the bonfire site and through a small side road onto Munich Street. They didn't make it that far. A middle-aged carpenter named Wolfgang Edel called out. He'd built the platforms for the Nazi big shots to stand on during the fire, and he was in the process now of pulling them down. Hans Huberman? He had long sideburns that pointed to his mouth and a dark voice. Hansi! Hey, Wolfel! Hans replied. There was an introduction to the girl and a Heil Hitler. Good, Liesel. For the first few minutes, Liesel stayed within a 5-meter radius of the conversation. Fragments came past her, but she didn't pay too much attention. Getting much work? No, it's all tighter now. You know how it is, especially when you're not a member. You told me that you were joining, Hansi. I tried, but I made a mistake. I think they're still considering. Liesel wandered toward the mountain of ash. It sat like a magnet, like a freak, irresistible to the eyes, similar to the road of yellow stars. As with her previous urge to see the mound's ignition, she could not look away. All alone, she didn't have the discipline to keep a safe distance. It sucked her toward it, and she began to make her way around. Above her, the sky was completing the routine of darkening, but far away over the mountain's shoulder, there was a dull trace of light. Pass off, kind, a uniform said to her at one point. Look out, child, as he shoveled some more ash onto a cart. Closer to the town hall, under a light, some shadows stood and talked, most likely exulting in the success of the fire. From Liesel's position, their voices were only sounds, not words at all. For a few minutes, she watched the men shoveling up the pile, at first making it smaller at the sides to allow more of it to collapse. They came back and forth from the truck, and after 3 return trips, when the heap was reduced near the bottom, a small section of living material slipped from inside the ash. The material? Half a red flag, 2 posters advertising a Jewish poet, 3 books, and a wooden sign with something written on it in Hebrew. Perhaps they were damp. Perhaps the fire didn't burn long enough to fully reach the depth where they sat. Whatever the reason, they were huddled among the ashes, shaken, survivors. 3 books. Lisa spoke softly as she looked at the backs of the men. Come on, said one of them. Hurry up, will you? I'm starving. They moved toward the truck. The threesome of books poked their noses out. Liesel moved in. The heat was still strong enough to warm her when she stood at the foot of the ash heap. When she reached her hand in, she was bitten, but on the second attempt, she made sure she was fast enough. She latched onto the closest of the books. It was hot, but it was also wet, burned only at the edges, but otherwise unhurt. It was blue. The cover felt like it was woven with hundreds of tightly drawn strings and clamped down. Red letters were pressed into those fibers. The only word Liesel had time to read was shoulder. There wasn't enough time for the rest. And there was a problem. Smoke. Smoke lifted from the cover as she juggled it and hurried away. Her head was pulled down, and the sick beauty of nerves proved more ghastly with each stride. There were 14 steps till the voice. It propped itself up behind her. Hey! That was when she nearly ran back and tossed the book onto the mound. But she was unable. The only movement at her disposal was the act of turning. There were some things here that didn't burn. It was one of the cleanup men. He was not facing the girl, but rather the people standing by the town hall. We'll burn them again, came the reply, and watch them burn. I think they're wet. Jesus, Mary and Joseph, do I have to do everything myself? The sound of footsteps passed by. It was a mayor, wearing a black coat over his Nazi uniform. He didn't notice the girl who stood absolutely still, only a short distance away. A realization, a statue of the book thief stood in the courtyard. It's very rare, don't you think, for a statue to appear before its subject has become famous? She sank, the thrill of being ignored. The book felt cool enough now to slip under her uniform. At first, it was nice and warm against her chest. As she began walking, though, it began to heat up again. By the time she made it back to Papa and Wolfgang Edel, the book was starting to burn her. It seemed to be igniting. Both men looked at her. She smiled. Immediately, when the smile shrank from her lips, she could feel something else, or more to the point, someone else. There was no mistaking the watched feeling. It was all over her feet. It was confirmed when she dared to face the shadows over at Town Hall. To the side of the collection of silhouettes, another one stood, a few meters removed, and Liesel realized two things. A few small pieces of recognition. One, the shadow's identity, and two, the fact that it had seen everything. The shadow's hands were in the coat pockets. It had fluffy hair. If it had a face, the expression on it would have been one of injury. Gottverdammt, Liesel said, only loud enough for herself. God damn it. Are we ready to go? In the previous moments of stupendous danger, Papa had said goodbye to Wolfgang Edel and was ready to accompany Liesel home. Ready? She answered. They began to leave the scene of the crime, and the book was well and truly burning her now. The shoulder shrug had applied itself to her rib cage. As they walked past the precarious town hall shadows, the book thief winced. What's wrong? Papa asked. Nothing. Quite a few things, however, were most definitely wrong. Smoke was rising out of Liesel's collar. A necklace of sweat had formed around her throat. Beneath her shirt, a book was eating her up. And that is the end of part two. So when we return from spring break, we will continue on to part three. I hope you've enjoyed the first two parts of The Book Thief and enjoy your week off.